The national conversation around Trayvon Martin has drawn thousands to protest, millions to debate, and has finally reached our highest office. Calling for national unity in the wake of the tragedy, President Obama told the country, "If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon." It's Friday, March 23rd, and this is Now. Joining me today, MSNBC political analyst and columnist for The Hill, Karen Finney, Ryan Lizza from The New Yorker, U.S. Army veteran and author Wes Moore, former U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffey. Thanks for joining us. Just a short time ago, President Obama made his first public comments about the shooting death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin.
You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon. And, you know, I think they are right to expect that all of us as Americans are going to take this with the seriousness it deserves, and that we're going to get to the bottom of exactly what happened.
Karen, I want to talk to you. You've been covering this beautifully over the course of the last week, and presumably we'll be talking about it later today when you guest host for Martin Bashir at 3 p.m.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome. When the White House had come under some, I don't know if it's fire is the right word to use, but had been under pressure to have the president comment on this. The Washington Post had a really interesting article, I thought, today discussing the fact that Eric Holder had been effectively their emissary thus far on this. Post Skip Gates, the president has been very reluctant to wade into any racially tinged waters. Yeah. What did you make of the statement today?
Well, look, I think the timing was appropriate because I think they realized that this story had moved dramatically from a local story to a national story and a broader question about gun safety laws, racial profiling. I mean, lots of other issues that this has brought up. So I thought he handled it beautifully. I mean, certainly going to the personal, I think was, that was what people wanted to hear, particularly given, and the president doesn't talk about his experience as much as a young African-American man, although he did in his book quite eloquently, and that struggle that you go through when you're a child of color, realizing that the world sees you differently. So I think that empathy and that sort of connection as a parent and as someone who has experienced that kind of anguish, I thought was really perfect.
Wes, I thought the statement, "If I had a son, he'd look like Kendall," was a really interesting comment from the president, because it isn't specifically talking about his experience as an African-American man, but it is immediately sort of doffing his hat to that. The fact that he is a black man, he would have had a black son, and it's a way for him to talk about race without actually talking about race.
And it was a way of really humanizing the situation, because, one thing that we're seeing with the conversation, it can be about the stand your ground laws or, legal implications and local versus national versus the feds getting involved. But fundamentally what this is also about, it's about two parents who lost their child.
Right.
It's about, that is the basic human element of all this. And that's what I think the president wanted to remind the American people, that, we have to go through the legal process to find out what's happening. We have to go through this process of determining what are the facts and then what are the implications of those facts. But let's not forget who and what we lost that day, almost a month ago. And I tell you, as a parent, it really is a very sobering and humbling reminder of exactly that fact, that this is a young man, a 17-year-old young African-American man in this case, but a 17-year-old man who was walking back from store to go back to his family's home and didn't make it back.
Right.
And we cannot forget that underlying fact of this case.
And yeah, I think you get the sense, especially in Obama land, where so much seems to be debated and I don't know, poll tested, but this, you really sense that this was an emotional issue for the president, and you could almost see him in the Oval Office saying, we gotta talk about this. It's time for me to say something.
I mean, you think about the important moments where Barack Obama, both as a candidate and a president, has discussed race. They have been personal, heartfelt moments. You think about back in the 2008 campaign when the Reverend Wright issue exploded, and he gave that incredible speech that probably saved his candidacy. And obviously this is an issue that he has thought about and written about for a very long time. And, frankly, he's never more eloquent when he's discussing the subject. I was talking to Representative Wilson this morning and asked her, before the president spoke, "Hey, do you want Obama to speak out on this? Are you disappointed?" And she said, "No, absolutely not. He is speaking with his Justice Department. The fact that there's an investigation going on, that's the sort of he's actually doing something about it." And So I think he's been reluctant as president to address many racial issues, frankly, partly because he's had a lot of other problems to deal with.
And Kendall, I want to bring you in here. As we talk about sort of the difficult dance the White House has with this, they, of course, can't be seen interfering with a state issue, a local police investigation. In terms of the controversy surrounding Trayvon Martin's death, how much do you think, we know that local police chief Bill Lee has temporarily stepped down today. What do you think the implications are now that the White House is sort of involved and obviously the Justice Department is involved?
Well, I think what the president did say was very appropriate, and I thought what he did not say was especially appropriate, because he didn't do anything to prejudge the merits, send a coded message to the Department of Justice. He does appoint and did appoint the Attorney General. He's the ultimate boss for the DOJ and the FBI, and I think his not speaking to the merits was extremely important. At the same time, DOJ, the Department of Justice, has put a strong message that they're going to look under every rock, behind every blade of grass, to see if there's federal evidence of a federal hate crime. And we have the Republican governor of Florida also, I think, taking commendable steps, appointing a special prosecutor, a state attorney from a different jurisdiction, to take over the investigation, a separate police unit, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, to conduct the investigation. So I think this, from a bipartisan, nonpartisan standpoint, is being handled very appropriately, with a high level of concern and commitment to learning the truth and making sure that justice happens here.
Kendall, I got to ask you, though, I mean, I think the notion that outrages a lot of Americans is that George Zimmerman is still a free man with a gun license. Right. And in your expert opinion, how long is it before that situation changes?
Well, it bothers me, too. It bothered prosecutors and police around Florida when this law was passed that allowed self-appointed vigilantes to become self-appointed executioners with a virtual license to kill. And that law does create significant obstacles. So I think it's important that they get it right this time. A lot of questions about whether the police department had a careful investigation before. Big questions. But they've got to get it right this time. And it has to be clear that if charges are brought, frankly, I hope they will be, that they're not brought in response to public outcry, but they're brought in response to a very thoughtful, thorough investigation that is seeking justice, not to placate an understandable sense of outcry and outrage across the state of Florida.
Wes, I want to bring you in here. We're talking about the investigation. One of the things that I thought was, shocking, and the details of the case are obviously tragic, but that Trayvon Martin's body was tested for drugs and alcohol. George Zimmerman never was. Yeah. George Zimmerman had a history of domestic violence petitions against him, resisting arrest with violence, and yet is a self-appointed neighborhood watchman with a gun. And just in terms of the standards in America, I think it was Joe Scarborough who brought it up this morning. If the dynamics of this case were reversed and you had a black shooter kill a white man, you can imagine that the response by the police department would have been significantly different.
Yeah, I think Joe Scarborough said it this morning. He literally said 2 words: game over. Mm-hmm. if it was reversed. But what's interesting, even when you look at the whole stand your ground law, and the person who's one of the co-authors of it, Dennis Baxley, even said, if you look at at least what we've heard thus far about the merits of this case, he's not even sure if this falls under the stand your ground law, simply because stand your ground has to do with an issue of self-defense if someone comes in as the aggressor. And he said, from everything we've heard about this case thus far, and again, this is from one of the sponsors of the bill, from what we've heard of the case thus far, that doesn't sound like that's the case in the case of Trayvon Martin.
But it appears that there are 2 things that were working in this case. Number one, clearly these laws are not well written, and clearly, he was able to say at the scene, I felt, I was standing my ground. The cop said, okay, you can go. So clearly we're learning about other instances where clearly the way this law is written is very problematic. In addition to that, this is something we talked about yesterday on the 3 o'clock. The biases and the stereotypes that we let fester in this country said to those police officers, I see a young black man dead, I see another guy with a gun who says he was threatened. Must be exactly as this other guy who happens to be lighter skinned.
No questions asked.
And to the point that Joe made, reverse, they would have walked up and said, I see a white guy dead and a black kid with a gun. Must have been, right? That's...
Well, and we will be talking more about stand your ground and gun laws in the country coming up. Unfortunately, we have to leave it there for now. Thank you to former U.S. Attorney Kendall Coffey. Kendall, thanks for joining us.